That was 4 years ago. LBJ was our president. There was no real hint in the winter of '68 that he was about to cash his check. And Johnson seemed every bit as tough and invulnerable then as Nixon seems to date. It's slightly unnerving to recall that Richard Nixon at that point in his campaign appeared to have about as much chance of getting himself elected to the White House as Hubert Humphrey appears to have now in February of '72. Wow. So Nixon, why are you even running, Nixon? I mean, LBJ's popular, but then LBJ just quits, and actually LBJ was probably sick because he's going to die like just a few years later. But he will not seek, nor will he accept the Democratic nomination. Instead, we're going to give it to Hubert Humphrey, because not John F. Kennedy, but Robert Kennedy was going to get shot and killed in '68. It should have been Robert Kennedy, but since it wasn't Robert Kennedy, then we should have had another great motherfucker. Hell, H. Rap Brown would have been better than Hubert Humphrey. Fucking Hunter S. Thompson would have been better than Hubert Humphrey. Goddamn Humphrey Hubert, assuming there is a person out there, would have been better than Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey is the biggest fucking douchebag you ever could fucking... Goddamn. You had the '60s. In the '60s, Nixon, the end of the '60s are going to be capped with Nixon. Fucking Hubert Humphrey. That's what you all did? When Nixon went into New Hampshire, he was viewed by the pros as just another of these stubborn right-wing waterheads with nothing better to do. The polls showed him comfortably ahead of George Romney. Oh, that's Mitt Romney's father. George Romney was for civil rights. He was a Republican in favor of civil rights. But according to most of the big-time press wizards who were hanging around Manchester at the time, the Nixon-Romney race was only a drill that would end just as soon as Nelson Rockefeller came in to mop up both of them. The bar at the Wayfarer Motor Inn was a sort of unofficial press headquarters where the press people hovered in nervous anticipation of the Rockefeller announcement that was said to be coming at any moment. So I was not entirely overcome at the invitation to spend an hour alone with Richard Nixon. He was, after all, a born loser. Even if he somehow managed to get the Republican nomination, I figured he didn't have a sick goat's chance of beating Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, but I was guilty, as all the others that year, of treating the McCarthy campaign as a foredoomed exercise in noble futility. We had talked about it a lot, not only in the Wayfarer bar, but also in the bar of the Holiday Inn, where Nixon was staying, and the press consensus was that the only Republican with a chance to beat Johnson was Nelson Rockefeller, and that the only other possible winner was Bobby Kennedy, who had already made it clear, both publicly and privately, that he would definitely not run for president in 1968. That's February. No, he's saying this in '72, February. How do you remember any of this? I was remembering all this as I cranked the big green Cougar along US 93 once again 4 years later to cover another one of those flaky New Hampshire primaries. The electorate in this state is notoriously perverse and unpredictable. In 1964, for instance, it was a thumping victory in the New Hampshire primary that got the Henry Cabot Lodge steamroller off to a roaring start. And in 1968, Gene McCarthy, I guess that's Eugene, is that what Gene is short for? Eugene woke up on the morning of Election Day to read in the newspapers that the last-minute polls were nearly unanimous in giving him between 6 and 8% of the vote. And even McCarthy was stunned, I think, to wake up 24 hours later and find himself with 42%. Strange country up here. New Hampshire and Vermont appear to the east psychic answer to Colorado and New Mexico. Big, lonely hills laced with back roads and old houses where people live almost aggressively by themselves. The insularity of the old-timers nursing their privacy along with their harsh right-wing politics is oddly similar and even receptive to the insularity of the newcomers, the young dropouts and former left-wing activists, people like Andy Kopkind and Ray Mungo, co-founder of the Liberation News Service, who have been moving into these hills in ever-increasing numbers since the end of the 60s. The hitchhikers you find along these narrow, twisting highways look exactly like the people you see on the roads around Boulder and Aspen or Taos. Represent Taos, New Mexico. Whoa, Taos, New Mexico. There was a Taos revolt and a Taos revolution. Taos revolt and a Taos revolution. The girl riding with me tonight is looking for an old boyfriend who moved out of Boston and is now living, she says, in a chicken coop in a sort of informal commune near Green Hill, New Hampshire. It's 5 or 6 degrees above zero outside. She doesn't even have a blanket, much less a sleeping bag, but this doesn't worry her. I guess it sounds crazy, she says. We don't even sleep together. He's just a friend, but I'm happy when I'm with him because he makes me like myself. And Jesus Christ, I thought. We've raised a generation of stoned, desperate cripples. She's only 22. A journalism graduate from Boston University and now 6 months out of college. She talks so lonely and confused that she's eagerly looking forward to spending a few nights in a frozen chicken coop with some poor bastard who doesn't even know she's coming. The importance of liking yourself is a notion that fell heavily out of favor during the Coptic anti-ego frenzy of the acid era. But nobody guessed back then that the experiment might churn up this kind of hangover, a whole subculture of frightened illiterates with no faith in anything. The girl was not interested, in whatever reasons I might have, for going up to Manchester to spend a few days with the McGovern campaign. She had no plans to vote in any election for president or anything else. She tried to be polite, but it was obvious after 2 or 3 minutes of noise she didn't know what the fuck I was talking about and even cared less. It was boring. Just another queer hustle in a world full of bummers that will swarm you every time if you don't keep moving. Like her ex-boyfriend. At first he was only stoned all the time, but now he was shooting smack and acting very crazy. He would call and say he was on his way over, then not show up for 3 days, and then he'd be out of his head screaming at her, not making any sense. It was too much, she said. She loved him, but he seemed to be drifting away. We stopped at a donut shop in Marlborough. Marlborough is a city? Marlborough. And I saw she was crying, which made me feel like a monster because I'd been saying some fairly hard things about junkies and loonies and doom freaks. Once they let you get away with running around for 10 years like a king hoodlum, you tend to forget now and then that about half of the people you meet live from one day to the next in a state of such fear and uncertainty that about half the time they honestly doubt their own sanity. These are not the kind of people who really need to get hung up in depressing political trips. They're not ready for it. Their boats are rocking so badly that all they want to do is get level long enough to think straight and avoid the next nightmare. This girl I was delivering up to the chicken coop was one of those people. She was terrified of almost everything, including me. This made me very uncomfortable. We couldn't find the commune. The directions were too vague. Go far to the dim yellow light, then right at the big tree, proceed to the fork, and then slow to the place where the road shines. After 2 hours of this, I was half crazy. We had been back and forth across the same grid of back roads 2 or 3 times with no luck, but finally we found it. A very peaceful looking place on a cold hill in the woods. She went inside the main building for a while, came back to tell me that everything was okay. I shrugged, feeling a little sad because I could tell by the general vibrations that things were not really okay. I was tempted to take her into Manchester with me, but I knew that would only compound the problem for both of us. Checking into the Wayfarer at 3:30, then up again at 7 for a quick breakfast, and then into the press bus for a long day of watching McGovern shake hands with people at factory gates. Could she handle that madness? Probably not. And even if she could, why do it? A political campaign is a very narrow ritual where anything weird is unwelcome. I am trouble enough by myself. They would never tolerate me if I showed up with a nervous blonde nymphette who thought politics was some kind of game played by old people like bridge. No, it would never do. But on my way into Manchester, driving like a werewolf, it never occurred to me that maybe I was not quite as sane as I always thought I was. There was something seriously bent when you think on it in the notion that a man with good sense would race out of his peaceful mountain home in Colorado and fly off in a frenzy like some kind of electrified turkey buzzard to spend 3 or 4 days being carried around the foulest sections of New England like a piece of meat to watch another man who says he wants to be president embarrassing a lot of people by making them shake his hand outside factory gates at sunrise. Earlier that night in Cambridge, over dinner at a bogus Mexican restaurant run by Italian junkies, several people had asked me why I was wasting my time on this kind of bullshit. McGovern, Muskie, Lindsay, and even Gene McCarthy. I had just come back from a long day at the Massachusetts Rad Lib Caucus in Worcester, billed as a statewide rally to decide which Democratic candidate to support in the Massachusetts primary on April 25th. The idea, said the organizers, was to unify and avoid a disastrous vote-splitting orgy that would splinter the left between McGovern, Lindsay, and McCarthy, thus guaranteeing an easy Muskie win. The caucus organizers were said to be well-known McCarthy supporters who'd conceived the gathering as a sort of launching pad for Gene in 72, and McCarthy seemed to agree he was the only candidate to attend the caucus in person, and his appearance drew a booming ovation that gave every indication of a pending victory. The night before, at a crowded student rally in Hogan Student Center in Holy Cross, McCarthy had responded to a questioner who asked if he was really a serious candidate by saying, "You will see how serious I am after tomorrow's caucus." The crowd at Holy Cross responded with a rolling cheer. The median age that night was somewhere around 19, and McCarthy was impressively sharp and confident as he drew roar after roar of applause with his quietly vicious attack on Nixon, Humphrey, and Muskie. As I stood there in the doorway of the auditorium, looking across the shoulders of the overflow crowd, it looked like 1968 all over again. There was a definite sense of drama in seeing McCarthy back on the stump, cranking up another crusade, but that high didn't last long. The site of Saturday's caucus was the gym at Assumption College across town, and the crowd over there was very different. The median age at the caucus was more like 33, and the results of the first ballot were a staggering blow to McCarthy's newborn crusade. McGovern cleaned up, beating McCarthy almost 3-1. When the final tally came in after more than 8 hours of infighting, McGovern's quietly efficient grassroots organizers had locked up 62% of the vote, leaving McCarthy to split the rest more or less equally with Shirley Chisholm. Both Muskie and Lindsay had tried to ignore the caucus, claiming it was stacked against them, and as a result, neither one got enough votes to even mention. The outcome of the Massachusetts Rad Lib Caucus was a shock to almost everybody except the busloads of McGovern supporters who had come there to flex their muscle in public for the first time. McCarthy, who had left early to fly back to Washington for an appearance the next day on Meet the Press, was seriously jolted by the loss. He showed it the next morning on TV when he looked like a ball of bad nerves caught in a crossfire of hostile questions from Roger Mudd and George Herman. That sucks. McCarthy was thinking he was going to win, flies back to Washington to get on Meet the Press, and then finds out he had fucking lost. So that would have been great. He won. He was on Meet the Press to say, here's how he won and here's what he's going to do for the country. That would have got him, shot him to the top. But since he lost, he probably shouldn't have flown back to Washington. Should have stayed there and kept counting the votes. And, maybe he just wasn't popular. He was clearly off balance, especially compared to, McGovern. Apparently McGovern is a stronger candidate than this McCarthy. Both seem to be exciting anti-establishmentarians. So McGovern supporters who had come there to flex their muscle in public, jolted. He was off balance, a nervous shadow of the rising tide hammerhead spoiler he had been on Friday night for the rally at Holy Cross. To make things worse, one of the main organizers of the Rad Lib Caucus was Jerry Grossman, a wealthy envelope manufacturer from Newton in the Boston suburbs, and a key McCarthy fundraiser in the 68 campaign. But after the Rad Lib Caucus, Grossman went far out of his way, along with Mudd and Herman, to make sure McCarthy was done for. He immediately endorsed McGovern, saying it was clear that Massachusetts liberals no longer believe in McCarthy's leadership quotient. What this meant, according to the unanimous translation by political pros and press wizards, was McCarthy won't get any more of Grossman's money. Grossman ignored the obvious fact that he and other pro-McCarthy heavies had been beaten stupid on the grassroots organizing level by an unheralded McGovern machine put together in Massachusetts by John Ruther, nephew of Walter, late president of the UAW. I spent most of that afternoon wandering around the gym, listening to people talk and watching the action, it was absolutely clear once the voting started that Reuther had everything wired. Reuther, Reuther, everywhere. I went there, was a local McGovern floor manager keeping people in line, telling them exactly what was happening, what would probably happen next, while the McCarthy forces, led by veteran Kennedy Camelot Field Marshal Richard Goodwin, became more and more demoralized, caught in a fast-rising pincers movement between a surprisingly organized McGovern bloc on their right and a wild-eyed Shirley Chisholm uprising on the left. Very good. Here's a picture of Shirley Chisholm. First major Democratic nominee or major candidate, maybe female, black female. You had in 68, you had that one comedian, that one guy, Dick Gregory. I think Dick Gregory might have been the first black man to run for president in the modern era. So that's Shirley Chisholm. So she's running for president in 1972. The Chisholm strength shocked everybody. Okay, we're going to come back to Shirley Chisholm. It's exciting stuff. What's going to happen in 72? I'll tell you what happens. In 72, it's going to be McGovern. McGovern's going to get the nomination, and we're going to have a bright, shining moment. America almost went 60s, almost went hippie, almost went peace, love, freedom, hippie. And it was McGovern, George McGovern, that almost got America there. But what's going to happen is Nixon is going to say he's going to pull us out of Vietnam. That's going to take the wind out of George McGovern's sails. Him being against the Vietnam War was one of the main reasons he was getting the resurgence of. But then when Nixon took his number one issue, and now Nixon was the peace candidate. You want to stop war? You want to stop the Vietnam War? Then you better vote for Nixon. And so when Nixon started talking about getting out of Vietnam, and eventually that does start the peace talks, and we do get out of Vietnam in 2 years, or 1 year. 1 year after the 72 election. We get out in 73, and then 74, 75. No, he gets kicked out in 75. But it's just right around the corner, and it's Gerald Ford, right? So Nixon is going to win the 72 election, then he's going to get impeached right away, and then it's going to be Gerald Ford. And then the Democrats in the Congress are going to pull the purse strings for the Vietnam War. And then everybody has to fly back the fuck home. And then Gerald Ford just kind of let it happen. What could he do? The Democrats just pull the purse strings. You don't have any money for your fucking Vietnam War anymore. You got enough money to get home. So why don't you just take that money, pay for a helicopter ticket, and come on home. And that was George McGovern's speech in 1972. Come home, America. Come home, America. The Chisholm strength shocked everybody. She was one of the 12 names on the ballot, which included almost every conceivable Democratic candidate from Hubert Humphrey to Patsy Mink, Wilbur Mills, and Sam Yorty. But after Muskie and Lindsay dropped out, the caucus was built far and wide as a test between McGovern and McCarthy.